Okay, great. So, hi, Achin, how you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, and it must be quite, it's early in the morning for you. And is it warm? Because here it's about anything between 37 degrees Celsius to 43 degrees Celsius.
Oh, geez. So let's see, to translate to Fahrenheit. So first off, it is early. Yes, it is 7 in the morning for me, and I think it's 4:30 for you, right? So you got the better end of this one, and it is not nearly that hot because that's like 95 to like 100. Yeah. So
more than 100.
Fahrenheit, more than 100. Yeah, no, it's like I'm in the New York area, and it's like 75 maybe. So like 23 Celsius, much more mild. So anyway, well, why don't I go ahead and introduce us? So I am Connor Echols. I am an associate editor here at Blogging Heads. Over the past few months, I've been producing and at times hosting a series of conversations about how different international actors view the world. And I'm thrilled to continue that series today with Achin Vanaik, who will be talking to us about all things India. So Achin has a background in lots of different things, but basically he's a scholar and activist who has studied the authoritarian right in India, as well as foreign policy, and a lot of other topics that we'll definitely want to get into. He previously headed the political science department at the University of New Delhi and is currently a fellow at the Transnational Institute. So thank you for joining me, Achin.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I'm also a founding member of what's called the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace in India, which is an organization, a network of individuals and groups which are opposed to nuclear weapons and to India becoming a nuclear state after its tests in 1998. I'm also part of the Indian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel.
Okay, well, thank you so much for adding those things. Quite a resume of things, and I'm very excited to touch on a lot of those topics. So, I think so. I want to talk about a lot of things, including everything from how popular Modi is to how India is navigating America's kind of increasingly aggressive stance toward China, and everything in between. But first, can you give me just a little bit of background on basically the rise of the Hindu nationalist movement and the organizations there like the BJP, which is Narendra Modi's party, and how they came to push out what had been the long dominant Congress party that had basically dominated since independence, if I'm correct.
Well, the Congress party's dominance really lasted for about 2.5 decades after 1947 Indian independence, and then started to get into all kinds of trouble. And then from the late 80s onwards, you begin to see the rise, mid-80s, begin to see the rise of the BJP and the cohort of organizations headed by a parent body which is called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which has in fact branches in the United States, the HSS and Hindu Foundation, others and so on, which is a network of all kinds of organizations, which is the parent body, the National Volunteer Corps, if you like. Is the English translation of the RSS. As we all know, there is a rise internationally of authoritarian right-wing forces, which means that your first point of analysis has to be an international one. Why has there been this rise internationally? And you'll see that this rise really takes place from the late 70s, early 80s onwards, and accelerates after the turn of the new millennium in many ways, right? So if it's starting around the sort of early 80s and on, why is it starting around then? And clearly, one fundamental factor is the shift in the nature of the capitalist economy to what's been called a neoliberal turn, or neoliberalism. And I think it's important to understand that neoliberalism is not a state of affairs, but is a certain direction that the capitalist economy has taken, with the results being, of course, massive increase in inequalities, weakening of the welfare state, huge problems of developmentalism because of the failure in third world countries early on. So it's very much a right-wing shift in economics. But such a right-wing shift cannot stabilize itself unless there is a right-wing shift in politics and ideology. And because you have, on one hand, a kind of globalizing of neoliberal capitalist economy, a transnational characteristic, but it's taking place in a world of multiple nation states. And the nation state remains central. So that means that when you want to look for the kind of stabilizing factors, right-wing stabilizing factors of politics and ideology, you have to be nationally specific. And therefore, in different countries, you had different ways and different kinds of politics and ideology, similarities, of course, which have helped to stabilize it. So Reaganism, Thatcherism, Le Pen, and so on, Duterte, Bolsonaro, all of that here. But there's one big difference, if you like, between all the more contemporary right-wing authoritarian populist forces which have become more popular and the RSS BJP. The RSS began in the 1920s, inspired by fascism in Europe. And the BJP, which is the electoral wing of what's called, what I said was the RSS, or the family of these organizations, what is also called, what we call the Sangh Parivar, family of organizations. This is the only one which has a continuous existence of over 90 years. It starts in 1924 and it has carried on and become stronger. Nowhere else in the world do you find this phenomenon, that your right-wing force has actually been there. Okay, they started after the Second World War, or they started much later, Bolsonaro, whatever. Here you have a continuous existence over here. And as the Congress Party declines, largely because of its failures to be able to address basic problems of development and so on, you begin to have a shift to the right, and you begin to have a turn of the ruling classes and big business and so on, also towards another alternative force which can help to stabilize it and which is growing. So the Congress Party paves the way. But you also had this particular force providing the kind of mass mobilizations that never existed in independent India, which are the strongest mobilizations in independent India, as compared to, comparable, if you like, to the kind of mobilization that took place in the struggle against British colonialism. And this is a factor that, of course, is greatly strengthened. Let me put it this way. What's the great difference between your Trump, between Duterte in the Philippines, between Le Pen, between Orban, and in Poland and Brazil? I said a continuous existence of over 90 years. Second, no other force anywhere has the depth of implantation in civil society in the way that this particular force through its organizations has. You're talking about a political party, the BJP, that counts 180 million members. Of course, this is bigger than the Chinese Communist Party, which is about 90 to 95 million. Of course, there is a bit of a trick here. In the case of the Chinese, they're very careful about who they get into the party. Here, anybody who clicks on a phone and says, I want to join, becomes a member, but still 180 million. But what is particularly important is has over 800 NGO-type organizations addressing all kinds of basic needs in the same way that, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood does or whatever, except at a much greater scale. 800 all over the country. It has four all India organizations. It has the biggest students' federation. It has the biggest women's federation. In terms of numbers, it has the biggest federation of trade unions. So you're talking about a force which is deeply implanted in Indian society. The third difference, of course, is this, unlike any other party in India, has never suffered a major split. It was first called the Jan Sangh. It fought against the emergency along with other forces. It became into power along with a coalition of other groups in 1977.
Maybe we should pause quickly. So could you explain quickly what the emergency is? Because I'm not sure that our audience will be
Okay, what happened was that India was one of the few countries which in what was called the Third World, which from independence actually established a liberal democratic kind of framework and setup, which is very unusual because liberal democracy really emerges when countries have substantially industrialized. In fact, in the United States, you didn't have full suffrage until after the Civil Rights Movement. You didn't have women becoming members, having suffrage of the vote in Switzerland until 1970 and so on. India, 1947, a poor agricultural country, establishes the liberal democracy. And it's functioning here. But under various pressures, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the leader of the Congress Party in 1975, imposed an emergency, which was, if you like, eradicating the liberal democratic character. An emergency annulment of all elections, ruling here. And ruling through, basically through repression, putting people in jail and so on. So that was called the emergency. In 1977, she was misled into thinking that if she has elections, she'll be elected there. She carried out elections and they lost. This is also a way to legitimize her rule, thinking that, okay, we've done the emergency, now legitimized. And then after 1977, a coalition of groups, including what was called the Jan Sangh, which was the earlier name for the BJP, came to power. This was pushed out by the other parties because its Hindu nationalist sentiment was very disturbing, and its Cadre force was disturbing to the others. So in other words, from 1947 till the 80s and so on, the official nationalism was opposed to what was called Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism, if you like, is very simple. It's an ethno-nationalism. It says India is a majority Hindu country, and because it's a majority Hindu country, we have to unite Hindus. And by uniting Hindus, we will make India strong. Now, and this is also the most democratic thing, because in a democracy, the majority should rule or the majority should decide. Now, this is actually a fundamental mistake, because the characteristic of a democracy is that, yes, the majority decides, but that majority is always flexible. It's a majority of citizens. It's not a majority of whites. It's not a majority of Catholics or Christians or whatever. It's a flexible majority. But here you have a fixed majority. India has a Hindu majority. Over 80% are Hindus, and therefore Hindus must rule. There was opposition to this. But what's actually happened since the mid-80s is that you have the center of gravity shifting, and more people in India accepting the idea that this is a Hindu nation and therefore Hindus have to rule. Now, how do you unite Hindus? There are only two ways in which you can try and unite Hindus. You have to have either a principle of unity internal to Hinduism, which is extremely difficult, because it's not like your monotheistic religions. There's many gods and goddesses, and also because of the caste system, which divides people in a way which is just incredible and horrifying in many ways, right? So they try to use a kind of Brahmanism, a sort of loose and accommodating Brahmanism, which is the ideology of the upper caste of Brahmins, to try to unite Hindus, but they can only go so far. The much stronger way for them to unite is to do what all your other authoritarian right-wing parties and forces are doing, and that is to have some scapegoat outside by which they can unite all Hindus against. Or if you like, how you can unite all Americans against those immigrants. Or you can unite in Western Europe, the French against the Muslims coming from outside or whatever. Or in Duterte's case, uniting people against your drugs and drug addicts and drug dealers or whatever. In other words, you have to have some kind of a scapegoat. And therefore, built into Hindu nationalism is a profound hostility to Islam and Hinduism. It's very interesting. In the national movement, they never really took part as an organization in fighting to overthrow the British. Because for them, the British were not really the real problem. The problem was, if you like, the Muslims and Muslim invaders who came in the 13th, 14th, 12th, 11th century and so on. And they call them invaders, whereas they're people who settle here and live here. But unlike the British, of course, who were ruled from outside. But anyway, so that's it. And they have this great strength, implantation. They've succeeded because they carried out all kinds of mobilization, and because they were addressing secular needs, and because the other political parties have failed. Because the other great difference between the other countries where you have right-wing forces and this is that in India, all the other parties put together are much weaker than the BJP, which is not the case, if you like, in Brazil, where you have other electoral political parties which are quite strong. It's not the case in France, where you have other parties, not just Le Pen's National Assembly, the Rassemblement National, and so on. So this has given a kind of hegemony to this force, which is extremely worrying. And what they've done in this whole period that they have made a transformation which is very, very dangerous. They want to establish a basic Hindu state. And if I were to sum up what they've done, it'd be something like this. they are hollowing out, they are seeking to eliminate or subordinate all other electoral political rivals. Either you join us or you ally with us, or we'll push you further on. That's what they're trying. Second, they're hollowing out Indian democracy and federalism. India is the most diverse country in terms of flora, fauna, topography, climate, wildlife, religions, languages, all kinds. So you have an India divided into 28 states and eight union republics, highly diverse here, and hollowing it out. Because all of these right-wing political forces, which are authoritarian populists, are authoritarian nationalists. We have the right to understand nationalists. And they don't seek to eliminate the electoral system and to establish a one-party dictatorship. They want to continue with the electoral process, manipulate it as much as they can because it gets legitimacy and because public everywhere. This is one of the great differences after the Second World War, is that people everywhere want some kind of liberal democracy. Even in the United States, for example, among those who say that we are not, these blacks are the problem or these Mexicans are the problems or whatever, and we need a stronger ruler, they're not going to say that we should just eliminate all democratic rights and freedoms. So the process is that these right-wing forces are manipulating within the democratic system to weaken it. And this is something that's obviously happened in so many ways since the 1980s. Once upon a time, democracy meant at the economic level, at the social level, not just at the political level, at the cultural level. What's happened? What's happened is enormous inequalities of income, wealth, and therefore power. If you have inequality of power, it means you're weakening your democracy. So what's happened, of course, is that democracy has been like butter on toast. It's become thinner and thinner everywhere. So this is the hollowing out.
And so to what extent, I guess that's interesting because when I'm trying to think about Modi and like how long, so just to clarify for people, so the actual timeline here, so we're talking about the 80s when these forces start to become more and more popular. You've got the first BJP prime minister in the 90s, and then it goes back to the Congress for a while, and then Modi finally actually is elected in 2014 and then emphatically reelected in 2019. So that's kind of the basic timeline, if I'm getting that correct.
Yeah, basically, yeah. They came in the 1990s in a coalition, and then you had 10 years of rule after the BJP. The BJP was in power, if you like, from 1998 to 2004.
Right. And they weren't as dominant as they've been today.
No, because they were in coalition, but in 1998, they turned India into a nuclear weapon state. They've been wanting to do this. They said, of course, the reason is China and Pakistan, but Pakistan got the bomb much after India did. And the BJP wanted the bomb before even China had the bomb. It's Johnson. So they always wanted the bomb for reasons to do with India must be strong and therefore we must have the bomb.
That's interesting. And I do want to come back to the stuff on nuclear weapons, but now I want to talk a little bit about, so to what extent is Modi's popularity and the right-wing nationalist popularity due to their weakening of democracy versus due to an appealing vision for the country, in a sense, right? Like how popular just going around talking to people in India is Modi?
Well, he has become very, very popular, but this is also something that has happened worldwide. And that is that what you find is the much greater personalization of politics. So the question is, why is there this greater personalization of politics everywhere? Well, we can connect it to a number of things. Once upon a time in the United States or elsewhere, and in Europe and elsewhere in other liberal democracies, you go on the campaign trail. You meet people here. What's actually happened in the electronic age? Television has become the medium of public conversation. Much more recently, added to this, has been another form of public conversation, which is your social media, right? Twitter and so on. So this is one factor, because television and the television becoming the media of conversation means the message becomes much more important. Television is not a medium like a book, in which you can think about issues and campaigns and this and that. It's how you come across that becomes important. A second development is, of course, that the differences between the main contenders for power in the United States, in Britain, elsewhere, India, on the question of economics and foreign policy has become much, much less. Does it really make that much of a difference? If either of these parts, so then that also becomes a factor there. So you've got your electronic media, this thing, personalization there. You've also got a whole factor that given this elimination of the differences or the weakening of the differences between the main political contenders, right? This also becomes a very important factor. And it's also a shortcut. People are now actually everywhere because of the deterioration in their livelihood conditions, working longer, working more, having all kinds of problems there. Where is the leisure time, if you like, that for them to even be able to think systematically or to go into such details or whatever? And what's also happened because of globalization is a kind of psychic disorientation. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the forces that actually shape your life are now so internationalized, the different forces, that you can't even begin to comprehend your own circumstances. So all this psychic disorientation also makes you want to cling on to those identities that are given to you. And you're much more open to messages. This is the problem. The sense of victimhood among ordinary people increases. And that sense of victimhood is related to their actual material lives, which have become worse. Youngsters like you in the United States in the 50s, 60s, 70s would leave home and get a job and all the rest of them. Now so many are living with their parents. There are, all kinds of problems that is way. And this also makes them more open to easy explanations for their victim, the scapegoat. They are the ones responsible. So all of these things have helped. And Modi, of course, was the first politician, and the BJP, which actually cottoned on to the importance of messaging. So he had the BJP had his website in 1995. The Congress party only got its website in the early 2000s. Modi has a Twitter following of 70 million, which is probably the single largest Twitter following. Now, he's a person who has a very rigid mind. He doesn't come into parliament for question hour. He never has he's the only prime minister in India who has never had a public press conference.
Oh,
even
really?
Trump had it. Yes, because he wouldn't be able to face the ask questions. So what does he have? He has his radio talk every week. He has interviews with select journalists. No press conference in his terms, public press conference. Even Trump had to do that. And plus, what's also happened is that the electronic media of television and radio and the print media have been greatly suborned. And this has happened because of the hold of the private sector and the private sector's connection to the Indian state. The Indian state has been much more responsible for promoting big capital than in the United States, which has its own history of capitalism emerging independent of the state to a much greater extent. And of course, what Modi has also done is that he's suborned the Supreme Court in India. The Supreme Court in India is probably the strongest Supreme Court in any so-called liberal democracy. And this has been greatly suborned. So he's got a whole set of repressive laws, both inherited from the British, as well as further laws which are made by the Congress and then by the BJP. And as a result of which, you have so many people being put in prison. You may be surprised to know that although the United States probably has the largest number of prisoners in proportion to its population, and Israel has by far the greatest number of political prisoners in proportion to not in proportion to population, and sometimes in absolute numbers. Do you know in India, there are some 70% of all prisoners are under trials. That is to say, they have been incarcerated for periods from months to years, still awaiting their first trial. So you can see the kind of, and of course more recently, etc., you also had this surveillance everywhere, surveillance technologies and so on. So all of these have helped. And now the easy answer for people to look at for their victim is to say, oh, well, this guy is a strong guy and he's appealing to us and he's speaking for us. So that's why many say that there are obvious fascist characteristics with the difference. The one difference, of course, between Hitler and the others is that Hitler could say that forget about the Weimar Republic and democracy. Nazism and one-party rule is a superior form of democracy. Here, nobody says that. They say, but this is democracy. Democracy is majoritarian rule. It's the majority of Hindus. It's the majority of ordinary people. So they maintain, if you like, the electoral system and by and large allow it, apart from manipulations, to operate fairly freely so that they can get legitimacy out of that.
Interesting.
And civil rights for, of course, some people, of course, and various people, but much more strongly repressing liberals and leftists in India.
Interesting. And so your analysis makes it seem kind of based on these larger forces that it's really hard to see how Modi would lose an election based on what you're saying. Like it seems like the grip that he and his movement have are pretty emphatically strong. So what would it take for him to lose?
Let me just qualify this here. What's happened is that before Modi came to power, any party that got a single majority on its own, which was the Congress, and now the BJP, right? Mm-hmm. In between, you had various coalition governments, okay? The Congress, when it had a huge majority rule in terms of the number of seats in parliament in the lower house, right? Never got, when it was ruling on its own, always got between, the total number of votes it got was between 41% and 49%. They never got even 50%. Modi in 2014 to 2019 got 31% of the votes, and in 2019 got 37%, but got a huge majority in parliament. Why? This is the problem with what's called the electoral system, the first past the post electoral system. What you have in the United States is 4 or 5 times in presidential elections. The president that gets more total votes the person who gets most total votes doesn't become president because you have this ridiculous electoral college system. In India, right? You have a similar, and at least in Western Europe, not in the UK, which of course has the ridiculous first past the post system. You have a proportional system, which is much fairer. India is a huge country, right? The party that comes to power gets power primarily if it is able to capture the votes of what is called the Hindi belt, which is North India, Central India. Hindus in the southern part of India do not speak Hindi. Their mother tongues are elsewhere, because we have so many different languages. We have, in fact, 22 official languages, and you have many more which are spoken by more than 1 million people. Tribal languages spoken by more than 3 million, and so on. So you have this. So the party that is able to capture the votes in the North Indian and Central India Hindi-speaking states tends to come to power either as the leader of a coalition or on its own. So you have an enormous diversity here. But Modi has a huge, solid majority of the seats because of this lopsided system. And that means that he can ram through all kinds of things. And of course, he's been doing that because he's taken advantage of the COVID lockdown to not even bother about parliament and just to pass ordinances and to bring about all kinds of rules. And what is hegemony? Hegemony is really three things, if I can just explain this thing quickly here. If you're going to be hegemonic or you're going to expand your hegemony, you have to be the principal arbiter between the different sections of capital. There may be capitalists who are pro-liberal, but they're mostly concerned about profits. And they want their profits. And the state has to play the role of being able to manage the differences and tensions within that. And capital will support you to whatever extent. Criticism is that, but tell you. The second thing is you have to get support from the middle classes, professionals. Third is that you have to use carrots and sticks to control and manage those at the bottom. And since there are always going to be lots of tensions between those at the bottom, 40%, 50% at the bottom, and those at the top, you have to both mask those tensions, and you must try and unify everybody. And the only way that you can unify everybody is by having an ideology of some kind of nationalism, which is why everywhere, whether it's Trump, whether it's Duterte, whether it's Bolsonaro, whether it's Le Pen, you're talking, and whether it's Modi or Orban or whatever, you're talking about them and their ideology, some kind of nationalism. This is what will make America great. This is what it means to be British. This is what it means to be truly French. How can we have those women wearing a hijab, which is an insult to the history of France and what we stand for, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And here, majoritarian nationalism of some kind of it. And that's common. And what has happened in India, of course, is that this Hindu majoritarianism has become stronger and stronger and stronger for a whole host of reasons. The negative reasons I've given you, economic decline, uncertainty, then there are all sorts of cultural factors that have also helped to build it. And in fact, if you want to be able to establish hegemony, you must control the media, you must control education, and you must also be able to try and control in India what's called Bollywood. And all of these things, in fact, this Modi regime has been able to do to a much greater extent than before. It doesn't mean that there isn't resistance and all that, but he's been able to do that. So you have the enormous weaknesses of the opposition, you have the objective circumstances which creates problems, and you have that. And by the way, for all the criticism that the US government and the British government and the French government make about what's happening in India because of attacks on Muslims and attacks on liberals and leftists and repressive actions of various kinds, etc. And this is where the foreign policy issue comes in. They're not that bothered, as long as India is a friend of the West against that terrible problem, the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
So you
that
have
is
and
a
of
good
course,
transition.
plus, of course, the other point. Modi and the Congress Party and all have to have big capital on their side. Therefore, they have to try and push the kind of economic policy that will make them bigger and stronger. So everywhere, as a result of this, you're having the gap of income and wealth between those at the top and the other worse and worse. And then you will have many people say, oh, this is a bad thing. But the people who benefit from this want it. And as long as India, for example, is pursuing economic policies which enable the rich and the powerful to send their money into India and to make profits, they're also happy. Huh? So if your foreign policy and your economic policy are okay with the other countries which are liberal democracies and all, then they'll tut and they'll say, oh, it's very bad what you're doing. We don't like this. We don't like it. But it's not going to change basically the kind of relations you have. The United States has had a history, as you know, of aligning itself with all kinds of authoritarian regimes of all kinds. But then it had to fight that terrible enemy, communism. You had Britain, the United States, and Western Europe having defense agreements, alliances with the apartheid regime of South Africa. It is only after it's overthrown, and they kept it going. And what were the arguments they used? Well, South Africa, whatever you say, is the best democracy in the whole of Southern Africa. Besides, we have to, worry about the communists, because Nelson Mandela, according to Margaret Thatcher, was a terrorist. Yeah. Only after he's released and all you have that. So I'm saying is that this is a picture in which you shouldn't let liberal democracies definitely preferable to authoritarianism. We have to make liberal democracy stronger and more democratic because it's weakening. But let's never forget that liberal democracies on the foreign policy front and economic fronts have done terrible things. And of course, this is never to let your authoritarian regimes off the hook. The Chinese and the Russians have been pretty rocky in so many ways, of course. But I'm just giving you a more general picture. So, yeah.
Well, great. So that is a good transition to foreign policy. So I think one thing that would be helpful to just kind of situate the foreign policy aspects of Modi and India today are kind of what is his broader vision for foreign policy? Like, how does Modi view the world? What does like a Hindu nationalist like Modi want to show the world about India, and how does that kind of set the stage for foreign policy?
Okay, well, there are many different levels at which one can answer this question. First of all, is that Indian foreign policy after independence was called non-alignment. And non-alignment basically meant that we keep away from these rival blocs, the Western Bloc and the Communist Bloc, and try to maneuver to get support and help from all sides. That was there. And that is something that made sense to the new ruling classes in newly independent countries, so as to maximize their room for maneuver, so as to get support and help in whatever way. But over a period of time, their failures and the end of and particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition of China to capitalism became the only game in town. And you find a shift both in economic policy, which really began in the mid-80s in India, towards neoliberalism. And of course, a closer connection with the West, with foreign investment and elsewhere coming. And you also had a shift in foreign policy, in which, of course, it now made sense for India, according to its most of its foreign policy experts and so on, to align itself more strongly with the West. One important reason or one important justification was the border dispute between India and China, which erupted in the 1962 border war, and has carried on off and on, and very recently turned place over here. So you have, of course, this shift, so in which India begins to align itself with the West. And for various reasons, this is something that was started by both the economic and the foreign policy was started by the Congress party. It wasn't done by Modi, the shift. What Modi has done is kept this, but accelerated the shift to the West, accelerated the shift to Israel, so that Israel has become more important, even though there was an opening out to Israel under the Congress. But that had more to do, if you like, with strategic considerations. Israel will also help us in our relations with the United States government. And, well, we have relations with the Arab countries. Why shouldn't we have relations with Israel? And so on. And so the Congress government only gave money and lip service to the Palestinian cause. Everybody talks about the Palestinian cause, but that's all it was really giving it here. What Modi has done is that he has added an ideological dimension to the Israel relation. And that ideological dimension is that he sees Zionism as being anti-Muslim, in the same way that, and anti-Islam, in the same way that Hindu nationalism is anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. Zionism actually is not anti-Muslim or anti-Islam. It's anti-Palestinian. But since the rise of Islamophobia, everybody is willing to piggyback on that. And so everywhere you find reasons why certain countries are quite happy to ride on it. The United States, for obvious reasons, the biggest resistance is coming from the Muslim part of the world for various reasons. I can go into that, but I won't do that. Right? You have India, which has had a lot of problem in Kashmir, which is the only Muslim majority state or part. Now it's no longer a state here. You have the Chinese having problems in Xinjiang, which is Muslim majority. You have the Russians having problems in Chechnya and elsewhere. So you can see how all these different governments see some benefit in also utilizing Islamophobia for their own domestic purposes. In fact, the proportion of armed personnel in Kashmir to the civilian population there is stronger than Israel's armed forces personnel in the occupied territories. It's shocking what's there. But apart from lip service, the United States and Britain and Europe isn't bothered because India is on our side. Because you see, it's part of our policy to contain China, because China is now the big problem.
Right. Actually, so it's this idea that there's, this whole alignment of kind of, in one sense, anti-Muslim sentiment, and then this more like muscular India. And they're also wanting to align with this Western bloc that's anti-China, that's kind of convenient, and that all adds up to this more forceful kind of foreign policy, if I'm understanding.
Well, there's also one other aspect, two other aspects, of course. One, of course, is the question of strengthening the relations with the US and the West for both economic purposes. In fact, India, until very recently, invested more. The trade with China is very much in favor of China, the balance of trade. Until very recently, Indian investment in China was greater than Chinese investment in India. But because of the tensions between India and China, and because Modi wants to play up the terrible China and the terrible Pakistan and the terrible alliance between the two, which also fits in with scapegoating others outside so as to strengthen yourself in the name of nationalism, right? Doesn't look to China and the Belt Road Initiative for ways to improve capital, even though some capitalists in India would like that, but to strengthen the economic relations with the West. And of course, for geostrategic reasons, also wants to strengthen it. But two differences. One is that Modi, when he first came to power in 2014, was because of the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in the state where he was chief minister, was persona non grata in many Western countries. In fact, he was not allowed to come to the United States after 2002 because of him being the chief minister when that pogrom took place. So no prime minister in India in his first term has ever made so many trips abroad in such a time. He visited over 60 countries as head of state. And this is not because it was necessary to go as a head of state. Most of your activities are done at a lower level. Have you heard of any person from no prime minister in India went to over 60 countries? Why did he do that? Because he wanted to move around so as also to establish himself as a kind of international statesman and to overcome that pariah status that he had. So that also became an important factor in his personal diplomacy to make connections in this. The other thing that he's done is that he, much more than others, has tried to use foreign policy for strengthening himself domestically. So when he comes to India, it's also to meet all sorts of other Hindu nationalist groups who can also lobby for him and also to project himself as a much more significant figure here. Going to the UN and talking about establishing and having established the International Yoga Day. So now you have an International Yoga Day. India's gift to the world was yoga. And now we have the whole world celebrating the Indian national day. Look what we've done for India. We've made its name. And of course, this idea of strong India, mighty India, it's a reflection of a kind of inferiority complex in many ways. We Hindus are the majority, but we let all these other countries rule us. And look at our great history and our great spirituality and our this, that, etc. Two countries are obsessed with their past and want to portray that past as a great, great, wonderful past, which is a contribution to the world. One are the Indians, the others are the Chinese. Now, every country has its own strengths and weaknesses. Let's be realistic about our strengths. Let's be realistic about our virtues. And let's also be realistic about our vices and our evils. And let's be more modest about ourselves. It's tiresome when we hear about America is the greatest country in the world. China is the great country. India is the great country. They're all countries that have many things that we look for, respect and appreciate. But try and be a little bit modest because you've all done pretty terrible things. The United States is the only country in the world that has taken the name of a whole continent to describe itself. When I was in the United States of America as a kid, I used to love baseball. Since I was in New York, I was stupid enough to be a supporter of the New York Yankees instead of the Boston Red Sox, right? What was it? The World Series in 1954, 55, 56 is only played between American teams, U.S. American teams, and it's called the World Series. There's small ways in which you have this kind of projection of yourselves in this thing here. And of course, it doesn't help. If you like, there are two kinds of nationalisms. One nationalism sees itself as inherited from the past. If you see the essence of your nationalism as something that is inherited from the past, there will always be disputes about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritors. Or you see, nationalism is something that belongs to the present and the future. It is what we will make of it. And what we want is to make a nationalism that is democratic, that is inclusive, that is humane, and which is decent. Immigrant countries have an advantage. Because they're immigrant countries, they tend to be more open. The United States has many strengths which are related to being an immigrant country, a certain openness. It had to be. As long as you forget about the massacre of the native Indians, of course, and the slave trade and all that, of course, yeah. But still, there are certain countries. But all of these countries are now becoming more closed in many ways under various pressures here. And there's always going to be a struggle. In other words, nationalism is a terrain on which we have to fight. There are different conceptions of nationalism, and we have to fight to make it more open and inclusive nationalism. And this appeal to the past, of course, is something that's very worrying. So this is your foreign policy. So with Israel, the ties are much closer on the ideological level. In fact, there's also a lot of borrowing of surveillance equipment from Israel. You have this use of foreign policy for domestic purposes. You also have this kind of nuclear India. There's a certain sense among many Indians who support Modi and even others that, look, China has made it big. What about India? We need to be big. We need to become stronger. More important. You know, I once gave a talk at Yale University to a large group of people, most of whom were of Indian origin studying in the United States. And I asked them one question. I said, what do you think, what is your criteria for judging the greatness of a country? Let us say India or USA or whatever. And what were the answers I got from this class about 24, 25? If we have the strongest military and we are the most powerful country in the world, that's when we can say we're great. We have great science and we are scientific masters. We have a very high average standard of living. Nobody talked about inequality, but average standard of living. Only one student said something which struck me and which I felt was the real criteria. He said the greatness of a society is the manner, the decency and dignity with which it treats the most emiserated and the most deprived and the most disabled in its society. And by that standard, I'm going to tell you very frankly, both the United States and India are pretty rotten societies. We have a lot to do for those people there. But then what is the criteria? Most people are hung up about greatness. And this, on foreign policy, all your real politicers and all, going on and on about, including liberals, all about we do this, that, etc. We now have 4 huge problems on the global level, which can only be resolved at the global level through showing a concern and cooperation of different countries and across countries. They cannot be resolved. What are they? One, you have the most incredible levels of inequality of income and wealth and the continued sustenance and maintenance of massive levels of immiseration and poverty. According to the UNDP, something like 1.5 billion to 2 billion people on a state of are not able to have address basic needs. They are undernourished and malnourished and undernourished. You can add a couple of 1.5 or 2 billion more if you're really talking about basic needs being more than just the question of having enough to eat and not being and being nourished. If you add the question of education, if you ask the question of health, if you ask the question of housing and shelter, you've got more. That's a huge problem. And it's not because the world doesn't have enough resources. Everybody knows that we have enough resources. If they were adequately distributed, nobody will go hungry. But we're not able to address this. In the past, there were problems, economic crises were crises of underproduction. Now you have overproduction and you have all this. This has to be resolved. The second problem, the question of the ecological dimension. What is the cop-out from the Indian side? China and the US are big emitters. India is about the 4th largest emitter of gases, but it hides behind the fact that per capita, we are very small. But the environment only listens not to per capita emissions, it listens to total emissions. What are you going to do about this, India? What about the Chinese? What about the Indians? Everybody is hung up about their own country, this, that, etc. You can't even come together. You've had a weakening of the Kyoto Protocol. So that to what you have now, the Paris Summit, you have Trump pulling it out, and everybody thinks Biden is great if he comes back. But of course, you only have voluntary limits. You don't even have penalties if people fail to meet their limits and all. You have this situation here. A third situation is the rise of these right-wing authoritarian groups. And the fourth is the nuclear question. Can you imagine? You are giving yourself the right to be able to destroy the human beings on Earth. You are giving yourself the right to deny the existence of future generations. You cannot be blamed for anything now. And what? All in the name of national interest, national security. And it's crazy. Do you know that there are 40 odd countries that have the capacity to make nuclear weapons, but many of them have decided not to. You have countries that have had nuclear weapons and given them up. Let me give you 4. South Africa. Under apartheid, you had nuclear weapons and gave it up. Belarus gave it up after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, which had the third largest arsenal, gave it up. And South Africa, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. They all gave it up. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, many others could make it, but they haven't decided. You have 9 countries that have given themselves the right to say that we should have the right in the name of national security. And the funny thing is, nuclear weapons are the most powerful military weapon ever. But countries that have nuclear weapons have all lost wars to countries that don't have nuclear weapons. It's more like a kind of hang-up, or let me put it in a slightly different way. There's a strange contradiction which is there. What is it that causes the risk of nuclear war? Question. Answer, nuclear weapons. If you don't have nuclear weapons, how can there be a risk of nuclear war? Second question, how should you deal? What is the best way to deal with the risk of nuclear war? Answer, have nuclear weapons. Deterrence. And in the name of deterrence, you're going a spiral of upward mobile weapons and all, which is just crazy. It's gone mad. You're now talking about the nuclearization of space, even according to the logic of so-called deterrence. And of course, one has to make a difference in deterrence and the capacity to deter. But I don't have time to do that. But what's happened is that you need an overall capacity. Isn't it enough if you can destroy the other country once or twice? Even now, even though you've come down from 70,000 to something like 15,000 nuclear weapons, you can still destroy human society on Earth many times over. And you're now talking about having a counter in order to be able to space what is called the US, which is the pace setter, the ballistic missile defense system. What is the ballistic missile defense system? Directed towards China and Russia. Everybody knows that, but the United States government pretends it's for Iran or North Korea. Nonsense. Everybody knows it's for the Russian Chinese. What is it? If the Chinese or the Russians throw their missile, we'll send our missile and finish it off above the atmosphere. We'll do that. Okay. So then what do the Chinese and the Russians have to do? They now have to overload this capacity. What does that mean? It means that now we must put lots of nuclear warheads on one missile so that even when we send many missiles, then one will get through. And that will deter them from throwing us. Because what happens if we have a ballistic missile shield is that the Chinese and Russians are worried. What if the Americans use their nuclear weapons to attack our military installations and destroy most of our nuclear weapons? Then the shield can mop up the rest that we have. So what we should do is we'll have to build more. We'll have to put more warheads on one missile so that even if one missile goes ahead or 3 missiles go ahead, we can knock out 30 cities in the United States. And we will have bigger bombs so that we can destroy more. So you're having a crazy arms race now at the nuclear level between China and Russia as reactors to what the United States is doing in terms of ballistic missile and theater missile defense system. And what does this do? This now means that it has a knock-on effect on India. The Indian government is saying the Chinese are making more and more nuclear weapons and missiles for that. So we better make more and more. And then what do the Pakistanis say? They say, why the Chinese Indians are doing this? They say it's for the Chinese, but we'll have to do it because they can use it against us. In other words, you have a nuclear arms race between India and Pakistan, which is not completely under their control. And lastly, let me say, is that of all the scenarios in which nuclear weapons can be used, one of the big bogeys, which I don't have time to go in, is this question of non-state groups getting a nuclear bomb and doing that. I won't go into the reasons why it's a bogey. The biggest culprits have been states. They've done the most terrible things. To this day, the United States of America has never even apologized for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Never even had the decency to apologize for it. One of the principal rules of war is that one thing to have combatants and to attack combatants. You don't attack children. This is a profoundly immoral weapon by its very nature. But anyway, of all the scenarios, the most dangerous is India and Pakistan because of what's called the escalation dynamic. Throughout the Cold War, unlike India and Pakistan have been geographically next to each other. They have had a continuous hot-cold war from the time they both became independent in 1947. They have had 4 hot wars. The United States and Soviet Union had proxy wars. They never had hot wars with each other. Even between USSR and China, you had a problem on the Ussuri River, but that was it. That was once the Soviet Union broke up, Russia and China immediately came to an agreement. There was no problem. And they never had this history of hot-cold wars. But you had this history of hot-cold wars. Very recently under Modi did something which is quite astonishing. Because of a terrorist attack in India, conventional attack, he actually sent a plane deep into the territory of Pakistan to conventionally bomb Pakistan. Whether that succeeded or not is a different question. This is the first time that a nuclear-equipped country has sent a plane deep into the territory of another nuclear country to bomb it. And these two countries are the only countries whose air forces have actually had a fight. What am I saying? I'm saying is that there's an escalation dynamic which is really worrying. And that escalation dynamic is that you had wars and you have a conventional war between the two. And in this conventional war, both sides start off by saying, look, we are not going to use nuclear weapons. We don't want to use. We know how dangerous they are and bad it is. Okay. But then as the war continues, one side begins to think, or the other side begins to think, well, I don't want to use nuclear weapons, but the other side might want to use nuclear weapons. So I better ready my nuclear weapons in case they do that. And this is actually something that happened in 1999 during the Kargil conflict, which was the last hot war between India and Pakistan. And fortunately here, in fact, the Americans played a positive role in pressuring for them not to do it. But this escalation dynamic means that you start off by not wanting to do it, but you end up in a situation where you seriously have to think about using it. And the Pakistanis have said very clearly to India, if you are much stronger than us conventionally, if you send in your conventional troops and they come too close and go beyond certain lines that we have drawn, we will use a small nuclear bomb on your soldiers in our territory. And then the Indians have said, if you use a nuclear bomb on Indian soldiers, no matter where they are, we will give you a massive retaliation. And you have that. So you have this crazy situation there. And many of us, like, for example, are calling for a South Asian nuclear weapons free zone, India and Pakistan. But then India says, oh, what about China? And so then that becomes an argument. Although China has never threatened India with nuclear weapons or any kind of blackmail or whatever. Anyway, what I'm saying is that you have this whole nuclear mess, and we've been very, very lucky. We've come very close at different times to different parts of the world using nuclear weapons. South Asia is very much neither the Indian government or the Pakistanis, and many Indians and Pakistani foreign policy experts don't like it when you say this is the most dangerous nuclear flashpoint, but it is. Because they say, do you think we are so irresponsible? You're pro-Western and all. No, I'm not pro-Western. Hammer the other nuclear weapons countries as much as you like. The United States has been the worst space setter. The Chinese and the Russians, all of them are ridiculous. And you don't have to. I mean, this idea that you need it for security and all, Sweden could have made it. It never bothered to make it. When it was closer to the Soviet Union, had a big discussion and decided not to. Jeremy Corbyn, if he had become prime minister, could have moved towards it. If Scotland breaks from UK, the UK will have a huge problem because its submarine base is in Scotland, which will close down. Then what should they do? You know what's happened? There are discussions between the British government and the American government saying, don't worry, if Scotland does go away, we'll help you build another, but you must keep your nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And why does the UK want nuclear weapons? Prestige. Why does France want it? Prestige. A lot of it has to do with prestige. We are tough, we are strong, this and that. But its actual value in terms of helping you to get these problems is so weak. You know why? Because the threat of nuclear weapons is so extreme that it doesn't have what's called fungibility. Fungibility is it doesn't have the exchange power. You can't exchange your threat of nuclear weapons to get more territory. You can't use that to get a better trade deal. You can't use it to force the other country to stop their immigration policy or whatever. The threat is so extreme that threat cannot be exchanged for benefits. But as long as people think that this is so great and it gives us so much power, and not just military power, but it gives us foreign policy power, which is why I pointed out this thing. The strongest military weapon you can think of, and all the countries that have nuclear weapons have lost wars to countries that have had to pull out, to countries that don't have. Vietnam, Russia and Afghanistan, the French in Algeria, the British from elsewhere. Anyway, I give you other examples. Sure. Suez and so on. So, I mean, this is the crazy thing. It was Albert Einstein who said that nuclear weapons have changed everything except the way some people think. How do you change that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I do wonder, it's interesting, and I want to move away from nuclear weapons and maybe do one last other topic, probably maybe thinking about vaccines next. But yeah, I do think it's interesting with nuclear weapons, and you're kind of talking about how India has become a little bit more kind of nationalistic under Modi with their stance on nuclear weapons, right? And their stance on and with border skirmishes. When we're talking about these, it's interesting to see how this more nationalistic vision has really brought him more in line with kind of the policy goals of the U.S. in particular, where you're talking about this ability and desire to counter China and Pakistan, which is interesting because that's obviously also a U.S. ally, so that's complex. But this nationalistic desire to show that you're strong to the people on your borders with whom you have disputes is interesting.
You see, the BJP, all countries that go nuclear say that because it's some other bad country that has nuclear weapons. The only country that couldn't say that was the United States that had it first. So it couldn't say that. But why did it have the bombs? Why did it use two bombs? And there were two different types of bombs. So for scientific reasons, they wanted to see how uranium and plutonium bomb works. But they also wanted to send a message after the Second World War was over to the Soviet Union that we're the top dog in the country. Right? Why does UK and France want nuclear weapons? They were the declining colonial powers, and therefore they wanted for prestige status. So you see, countries either want nuclear weapons. I mean, there are three reasons why countries say they want nuclear weapons. One is to deter another country. That's what they say. Second is for prestige purposes. And third, because they think they should strengthen their foreign policy. If you like, these are your three reasons. But one of these reasons is always the predominant one. To explain the origin. The United States, top dog. We'll show the Soviet Union future. This is us. Britain and France, prestige. Declining, but now we can sit at the high table. Britain and France, we have nuclear weapons. Why does the Soviet have it? The Americans have it, we've got to have it. Why do the Chinese have it? 64 by China and 64, their relations with Russia were also very bad. The Russians have it, and the Soviets have it, and the Americans have it, we have to have it. But the Jan Sangh, which was the forerunner name of the BJP, wanted nuclear weapons before China got nuclear weapons in 1964. And it was the only party that was saying, in 1974, India had an explosion under the Congress party, just to show it, but didn't go ahead to become a nuclear power, just that we're having a peaceful nuclear explosion. And that was for domestic purposes, to show, get some popularity now. But when the first time the BJP comes to power in 1998, it goes into the bomb. A long-standing point. Didn't really have anything to do with China because from 1964 to 1998, there's no real war between China and India. That already took place in 62 and China got what it wanted. In fact, it defeated India. It had a lot of Indian prisoners and then on its own, unilaterally, it released the Indian prisoners to go back along with their guns because it had got what it wanted. India has never accepted that in any case. But then it comes in 1998 and the BJP government, that time it was not Modi, said we have to have it because India and Pakistan and China. Pakistan got the bomb in 1980s, 87 or so, but never exploded it. And always proposed to India, you get rid of your bomb, we'll get rid of bomb. If you like, there's a kind of national nuclear security song of India and the national nuclear security song of Pakistan. I won't sing it, but let me just give you the content of the national nuclear security song of Pakistan. The national nuclear security song of Pakistan goes like this: India, 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 India. That's it. The national nuclear security song of India is Pakistan, Pakistan. No, China, China. No, Pakistan and China, Pakistan. Oh, we can be big shot, big shot, big shot. That's it. In a very facetious way, I've basically given you the kind of very arguments, which are basically, the Indian case is much more to do with prestige. BJP, we have to be strong. In the Pakistan case, much more to do like Russia and China. You have it, we've got to have it.
Interesting.
Which is not to justify any of these countries having it. But all of them say, oh, it's because you others are the baddies. And then what do these 9 nuclear countries say? You're the baddie. India, we are the nuclear goodie. Since we're having an alliance with the United States is the nuclear goodie. China and Russia are the nuclear baddies. And Pakistan. And Iran, and the central argument, national security, any country can use it. Should Iran use it? No, not it. It's only us. So the argument, which is a logical argument, is a universal argument that can be used by any country if you believe in deterrence. But all those who believe in deterrence say, no, not you, not others, but only us and our allies. What does it mean? Your self-portraits of you being nuclear goodies and others being nuclear baddies or nuclear unreliables. You're all a bunch of nuclear crooks.
Well, that's emphatic, and I think a good point to transition to one last quick thing that I do think is interesting because I'm not sure that it lines up super cleanly with a lot of the other things that the Modi government has done, and that's been their pretty consistent efforts to fight the patents of vaccines at the World Trade Organization. I'm kind of curious how, and I can see this in a lot of ways, it's very similar to an old school Indian foreign policy where you've got this kind of desire to be with like the downtrodden of the world. So can you help us understand that kind of briefly?
Please. Don't start off with an assumption. If you have to assume anything on the basis of that much knowledge, always assume the worst of Modi and this. Okay? Let me explain this and just point out what happened here. First of all, do you know that India has only inoculated 5.5% of its population? 2 doses. 23% have got 1 dose. This is the only country which gave a 4-hour lockdown. Only 4 hours before it carried out lockdown. And that lockdown caused tremendous problem for migrants and this. Utter irresponsibility. India has, over time, as you perhaps know, a very strong pharmaceutical industry, which played a very positive role with regard to providing cheap drugs for HIV, much cheaper than others and all, and therefore opposing the patents and also getting cheaper and all the rest of it. Right? They had the capacity to actually try to address this. But what actually happened? What actually happened is that 2 private companies, Bharat Biotech and Serum in India, Serum Institute.
The Serum Institute, right? Yeah.
Institute. They produced it. And what does the Modi government do? Apart from how it messed up the whole arrangement of this thing, it allowed 50% of supply to come to the market so that these private producers could make profits. Everywhere else in the United States and Western Europe, what the governments did was that even when they are produced privately, they have to be bought by the government or they're given free to everybody. The Indian government allowed the private sector to make profits on this this thing here, right? You also then had 50%. With a lot of pressure and opposition later on, it reduces to 25%. But no other Western liberal democracy has allowed private producers to sell on the market to make profits out of it. It's taken by the government. They could give them the money that have the profits, and then the government arranges for distribution or whatever, or they do it through other means and all the rest. This itself is shocking. You talked about the whole question of how India and Brazil have been talking about having patents. Yes. But do you know that the same Modi government, what a contradiction it is. There are a number of other companies besides these two, Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech, which have the capacity to make the vaccines. But it has not allowed compulsory licensing. It's talking at the international level about how you should be concerned about the developing world and all the rest of it. In other words, you shouldn't have this patent rights and all that, which we of course support, that there shouldn't be these patent rights, you should be here, all the rest of it. But within India, because of its close connection to these two companies, etc., it's not allowing a whole range of others to actually produce. And the result is that we have a huge supply problem. And things are going very, very slowly. Not enough people are being vaccinated. There was one day on which the government made sure that you had the hugest ever number of people vaccinated. And that was on the 21st of June, 2021. Why was it done on 21st June 2021? Because Modi wants to have a big impact globally. Because you know what that day was? It was International Yoga Day. I mean, you laugh, but this is the kind of symbolic politics, international. Yeah. And the problem is we don't have enough supply. And now you're having a possible third wave. Why don't you give licensing to a whole host of others who can produce it? You don't do this at home. And then you talk about it at the international level. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it at the international level. But please forgive me. Isn't this a contradiction? Isn't it an embarrassing and shocking contradiction that for the image purpose or whatever purposes we have internationally, but you don't allow the formula to be given to others so that they can produce it? I mean, asking you this. I mean, I would like an answer from you because you seem to have been impressed by what this Modi government is internationally. Sure. So the next time you talk about it, please point this out.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, I think it's clearly contradictory, but it is interesting. I mean, the sense that, well, in a sense, it's not contradictory because he's got the goals of, it seems based on our conversation, he's got the goals of advancing his interests domestically from looking like the international nice guy, right? The statesman that's helping to free vaccines up for the rest of the world, while at the same time can benefit the people that are his actual constituency, or at least the people that are able to give him money to back up his constituency at home. I think it's, in a sense, it seems like a contradiction, but it all benefits him, right?
It doesn't benefit because we're not enough supply of vaccines. Our supply, we need to vaccinate much more. We're only 5.5%. We have to vaccinate a huge number of people. China has done a much better job. Russia has done better jobs. Proportionally speaking, it's ridiculous. I mean, you have a huge population in India, but proportionally 5.5%.
Yeah.
The United States has got this. This is it. And the biggest reason for this is the lack of supply. There's not enough supply. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's held back. So if you expand this, so it's, in that sense, it's terrible.
Oh, definitely.
It's just terrible. And the point is this thing is that, well, what can I say? I mean, and I mean, I can say much more about so many other things, but I think that's giving you a general idea of the kind of situation here. Mm-hmm. And I mean, what shall I say? The only thing I can say to you is that he has a ministership, 77 ministers in his cabinet, Modi. There's only one Muslim, who's what we call a chamcha, a factotum, carried on in this thing here. So there's a very profound and fundamental anti-Muslim dimension to Hindu nationalism, which is a break from Gandhi and Nehru and all the others here. And that's something that's extremely worrying. In fact, we have one of the biggest farmers' agitations going on at the moment, which is also something that he's basically a kind of a strong man, and has a strong man image and will not bend, and he's determined to carry out a transformation of Indian society to make it an Indian majority state. I'm sorry I talked a long time.
Oh, no worries.
I've also told you that Indians love to talk, so I must give one story that confirms this fact. Many years ago, this is when India was just embarking on its new economic policy. There was an international economics conference in Seattle, Washington, right? And the delegates from all over the world, they had come and speak about their country's economy. And everybody was given 15 minutes to speak. So the British delegate, the US American delegate, German, they all spoke 15 minutes. The Indian delegate was speaking about India's new economic policy. He spoke for 55 minutes, 1 hour and 35 minutes he spoke. And then everybody, the delegates were taking a plane back from Seattle, Washington to New York. And the plane got hijacked by terrorists. So the terrorists said to all the delegates, listen, we'll each give you one wish and then we're going to shoot you. So the British delegate said, you please give me my roast beef and lobster pudding. The Japanese delegate said that you please give me my sake. The German delegate said, you please show me that video of Germany winning the football World Cup. The Indian delegate raised his hand and said, you please let me make one more speech about India's new economic policy. And then the US delegate said, listen, you please give me my wish. You please shoot me before he starts.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on. And so I think we'll go ahead and leave it there. But thank you so much for all of the insights that you've given into Modi and right-wing nationalism in India and how that affects how he views the world. So yeah, so thank you again.